Okay, everybody. I think that uh, I hope that we can proceed. This is week 13, and I'm coming to you from my office, not the lecture theater. None of you came to the lecture theater, and anyways, given the given the recent surge in cases, it just seemed advisable to do it from my office. So I hope no one this week decided to go to the lecture theater. All right. So, in any case, I'll carry on from here, and I hope that you all are keeping well and keeping safe. All right. And so let's go through a few things today. Primarily review, and if you have questions, then feel free to ask me. Let me first just sort of run through what I would consider to be the key concepts that you should be familiar with and paying attention to in your review. Metafunctions. Now, this is indeed one of the most important principles, the metafunctional principle that underscores systemic functional linguistics. The idea of meaning. We begin with meaning. Meaning has priority, and we identify the kinds of meaning. Three kinds of meaning we've talked about: ideational, with subcomponents, experiential and logical, the interpersonal, and the textual. So, in terms of the ideational, as I just said, there are these two subcomponents: the experiential, how you experience the world; logical, how you sort of combine your thoughts together and express them. The logical relations being, are they paratactic, hypotactic? Is there a symmetrical relationship, an asymmetrical relationship? The interpersonal, mood, whether you're giving information, declarative, subject and finite forms in terms of that sequence suggested declarative. I'm giving information. Turn them around, you get a question. I'm expecting to receive information. From that standpoint, mood, the mood structure. What is the mood structure? It's the subject and the finite verb, their presence or absence, and if they're present, their sequence. Modality, the use of modal auxiliaries, right? How you express attitude, how you express the judgments that you make, and so forth. And finally, the textual, identifying in terms of textual meaning, the structure of how you are presenting the information, whether you are, the method, as we put it like this, the method of development of the text, how it develops. And so, of course, that will relate to the rhetorical structure. It relates to the flow of information, and information being given information and new information. Three kinds of meaning. In terms of then going on, how these meanings are realized in language, realized in terms of grammar. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. That means the form that language takes, the form that realizes the meaning. And in terms of the experiential, process, participant, circumstance. Sounds so simple, but yet it's quite revealing in terms of how we perceive, how we construe the world. The logical. Again, I said symmetrical, paratactic, asymmetrical, hypotactic. Embedding clauses within phrases, like in post-modification, rank shifting, nominalization. mood and modality, theme and thematic progression. These are the realizations of meaning. Now, I think by now these should be all quite clear to you. Texture, what's cohesiveness? What's coherence? This is one of the questions that I posed to you in that list of 8 questions. What's cohesive? And this comes down to what? The patterning that you identify in language. Patterning of what? Patterning of choices related to what kind of process? Who is the doer? Whether you see more parataxis or more hypotaxis, the choices that you make with respect to the theme, is it continuous thematic progression, pointing to a certain continuity, a cohesiveness. So that cohesiveness comes from the patterning of choices that you make in terms of wording, the realization of meaning. The architecture takes it to a higher level. We're looking at how the various, what we could identify as parts of the text. And we see a text as hierarchically structured. It begins with the clause at the very bottom. We say the clause is the most basic lexicogrammatical unit. And the clause combines into sentences. Those sentences combine together, perhaps through a continuous thematic progression, into what we might call functionally significant text spans that can range from clause to sentence to paragraph to section up to the text as a whole. Now, how are those parts through this hierarchical organization? How are they related? That's where we came to rhetorical structure theory, looking at how those logical relations that exist between clauses exist likewise between these functionally significant spans of text. But we don't just look at a text by itself. We also look at it in terms of its context of situation. This is very important in terms of, and what is context? Field, tenor, mode. And the choices that you make in language are very much decided by the context in which you are speaking, in which you are engaging with someone else. That engagement with someone else, that interaction, takes place in a context in which you are talking about something in particular. What you are talking about matters. Who you are talking about, who you are talking to matters. And how you are communicating. Is it over the phone? Is it by texting? Is it in person? All of these factors enter into the choices then that we make about how we present ourselves. Right, likewise, the mode of discourse will also be significant. Is it speaking? Is it spontaneous speaking? Is it something that is planned? Is it scripted? Written discourse, spoken versus written, are different. How are they different? We looked at people like Trump and how they would speak in what many people would regard as unsuitable for, given who he is in terms of his role as president, in the context in which he is speaking. So in that example that we talked about, Trump at CIA headquarters, many were offended by the fact that he was standing in front of a wall on which were sort of a memorial to those agents that had lost their lives. And what does he talk about? He talks about his inaugural and how many people there were, whether it was raining. So in so many respects, it seemed, and it was just like he was spontaneously speaking about this. It was just as it was coming. So in all these respects, it just didn't seem to fit. And people responded in a very negative way. Grammatical metaphor, language of science. What is grammatical metaphor? Yes, it's turning verbs into nouns, but it's more than that. It's more than just turning verbs into nouns. It is generally a shift, yes, toward in the direction of nominalization. But in so doing, do you notice what happens to clause structure? Whereas, how did we say you can identify a clause? By the verb, the presence of the verb, the presence of the process. Now, when you turn those verbs into nouns, what you do is you turn those happenings into something. Now, in talking about that something, you are having to talk about it with respect to something else. So instead of conjunctions that were being used to join clauses, you now have shifted those clauses into noun phrases or nominalizations that are now being connected up by, instead of a conjunction, a verb, a process, and typically a relational process. And so when we talk about grammatical metaphor and the effect that it has on writing in the language of science, there's a lot happening there. And these shifts have become so much the so predominant that they have become the drift, the direction in which the language is going. We talked about verbal art, use of metaphor, verbal art. And Hassan talks about a poem as being an extended metaphor. The metaphor, the poem itself becomes a metaphor because the poem itself takes on a particular sort of structure. The poet, the verbal artist, produces a pattern. Again, there, patterning in terms of choices of wording that becomes sort of the new default, the expectation for what's going on in the text that you're looking at. And then chooses to foreground against that by breaking that pattern. And in so doing, draw your attention to some aspect of meaning that they are trying to project. Now, we looked at various text types throughout this course. We've looked at poetry. We've looked at dramas and plays. We've looked at academic use. You especially have looked at abstracts, political speeches, motivational speeches. Now, I ask you to go back and look at those examples and be aware of what we said about what was taking place. Yes, you should be prepared to talk about poetry. You should be prepared to talk about dramas, plays. I'm not identifying what kind of text will be sort of the focus of the exam. I want you to go over and be prepared to look at and be able to observe and make observations about whatever kind of text as we have looked at throughout this course. Poetry, the works of Tambu, Frost, analysis by Hassan, Les Murray's poem, the dramas and plays, The Sunset Limited. Do you remember the Cormac McCarthy's Sunset Limited? We looked at it in terms of black and white and their engagement, their interaction with each other. The dialogue is as revealing about their personalities. Murder on the Orient Express. We looked at the example there. There seemed to be a use of the existential, giving it a sense of rationality, which was then later sort of thrown out. Again, a kind of de-automatization. Academic, political speeches, Obama, Nixon, Trump, motivational speeches, Jobs, Steve Jobs, Rice, Susan Rice, David Foster Wallace. Okay, so this gives an overview, and I've just tried to give briefly an overview of the kinds of topics, the kinds of that I've believed to be sort of the key concepts and key things that we've discussed over the course of the semester. I did ask you about some sample questions. Okay, so I thought I'd just quickly go through some of these sample questions and give you some idea and so forth what how one might have answered them. These are questions that were on past exam papers, okay? What are the strengths and weaknesses of systemic functional theory for analysis of text? Well, of course, I would emphasize the strengths being that we're actually looking at how language makes meaning, the insights that we gain through a focus on meaning and then its realization, looking at language from the standpoint of its purpose, that's function. What function does it serve? And then on the basis of that, looking how we use language to accomplish that purpose. But one of the aspects that might be considered a weakness of systemic functional linguistics is it's very clause-based. Why is that? It's because Halliday believed that our approach to language should be more, what you could say, empirical. It should be more objective, more scientific, in the sense that we're not just sort of ad hoc saying things about language or about meaning, or this poem means this or that. No, we are looking at it from the standpoint of the grammar. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. But then when we're thinking grammatically, then where is the grammar? Grammar's in the clause. When we talk about process, participant, circumstance, that's at clause level. We talk about theme, that's the choice at clause level. Mood, modality, all of these are taking place at clause level, in the clause, right? So it's very much clause-based. But then we do need to get outside of that, to go beyond that, to see that the text as a whole, to see the clause as sort of the realization of the larger text. And once though we get outside of the clause, we are sort of outside of that territory, which is sort of bounded by grammar. Now that is when we need to draw on, for example, rhetorical structure theory to complement a systemic functional perspective that is more clause-based. That would be sort of how I would approach this question. How is interpersonal meaning expressed in a text? Well, this is extremely easy, really. Mood and modality. But when you answer a question like this, may I warn you, don't think, oh, I got it, mood and modality. No, you need to explain yourself, of course. When I look at your exam paper and I look at your answers, what I'm looking at is how you elaborate it so that I really know what you're talking about. What is mood? Why is mood significant for interpersonal meaning? Why is it significant whether I'm making a statement or I'm asking a question? Well, how is that interpersonal? It's interpersonal because it relates to how I perceive my role. Am I giving or am I receiving? Now, a point that I've made before, and that is that interpersonal meaning is not just mood and modality. There are aspects of it that we probably do not yet, have not yet sort of incorporated into the grammar. There are aspects of interpersonal meaning that come through the intonation that we use, the gestures that we use. These are aspects of also that would relate to attitude. Remember, I gave you the example of Obama's speech and his use of "you should pass this bill," pointed finger, and his facial gesture, his facial expression. All of this expresses interpersonal meaning. But two aspects of it related to the grammar of the clause are mood and modality. How is thematic structure related to the method of organization of the text? Here you actually need to get into thematic progression. It's the choices that you're making. And and I mentioned this before at the outset, I was saying that one needs really to be able to, if it, for example, if it is continuous thematic progression, there's a continuity there. That continuity identifies a block of text. If the clauses that you've identified all as sharing the same sort of theme, then they sort of are clustered together. They are this functionally significant text span. So you begin to see a hierarchical structure identifiable by the texture of these spans, the repetition, and that involves theme as well. Thematic progression, linear thematic progression, again, it's a flow, but it creates also a sense of continuity. It's like a thread that runs through the text. So this thematic progression information flow, if I was asked about how thematic structure relates to the organization of the text, I'd look at it from the standpoint of thematic progression. Excuse me, I have to check something. Fourth question, discuss the relationship between context of situation and the text. I remember we talked about Ruqayya Hassan's context metafunction hookup hypothesis. What's it mean? It means that I mentioned something about this earlier, and that is the idea that when we are within a context of situation, how we see that context of situation is going to cause us to communicate, to speak, to understand in a particular way. Likewise, her point was, it works also the other way. The way you speak makes people draw conclusions about how you perceive the situation. Example, if you're speaking very informally to somebody and you realize then that how they're speaking is how they perceive the situation as being very informal. And their role, their level of politeness, their level of formality will give you impressions, will make you draw conclusions about how they perceive you, the listener. how they are responding, how they then will respond will be based on what they perceive as how you perceive the situation. Because you're going to draw conclusions about the way one is speaking, about what that context is then in that case. You see the point? On the one hand, context, yes, influences the way that we use language. But likewise, the way we use language influences the way we see the context, the way we see what is your perception of the context. How, from the way you speak to me, I have an impression about how you perceive your relationship with me. I draw conclusions from that. From the way you speak to me, I perceive how you see the situation. I draw conclusions from that. Discuss what is meant by foregrounding. I've always liked the phrase that Professor David Butt uses, and mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. Look at the other examples that we've looked at before in terms of how a particular sort of automatic, a particular default, a particular patterning is created. When we looked at, for example, Edwin Tumbu's poem, Gods Can Die, we saw how he very deliberately sort of created a very paratactic kind of background. Everything was dual, the duality of everything was predominant. And so this duality, this came through then in his use of grammar as well, very highly paratactic, and he used words that were antonyms of each other. They're pairs of words that were related opposites and so forth. All of this, he then, though, would sort of deviate from when he'd get to the point where he was talking about that friend of his whose behavior he found to have changed because that friend now saw himself in a superior, more powerful, more authoritative position, and now could no longer relate on those same friendly terms. But where that is mentioned, where that sort of negative perception of that friendship and how the friendship has changed, that came through in parts of that poem that were very hypotactic. So the mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice means taking the ways that we use language in the ways that for what they mean, and produce a pattern, non-habitual consistency. They come through so predominantly to the point where they become the automatic. They become the default. But taking those patterns that the poet or the dramatist or whoever is the verbal artist creates, and then from that background, foregrounding against it. Hassan mainly talks about this in the upcoming. A little bit later, I will also be talking more on this subject. So let me skip on to that. What are the advantages of incorporating probabilities into a systemic functional model of language? What are the properties of the system of language? Remember, we talked about language as being a system. Systems of choice. Meaning, potential of language are these systems of choice. But what are the properties then of these systems that make up language? Now, what do we mean systems? Why plural? Well, go back. How is experiential meaning realized? Through the system of transitivity. Transitivity being choices that you have about process, participant, circumstance. The systems are those sort of sets of grammatical options. And when you go back to process, participant, circumstance, you have a choice of how to represent the process. Is it a doing kind of process? Is it a mental process? When you think about it, for example, he's watching TV. What's he doing? He's watching TV. That picture in your mind is he sees something. But you're not saying it with a mental process, you're expressing it with a doing process, watching. He saw the bird, he's watching the bird. Two different ways of being able to talk about it. All right, that comes back to my point though. You see the system of transitivity as a choice of process, participant, circumstance. And within the range of process, you have choices about whether it will be doing or which we call material or mental or relational, behavioral, existential. Now, that list of choices that you have, that is one of the properties of language, that language is paradigmatic. Paradigmatic. You have a range of choices. Now, we said that we could represent those choices in a network sort of layout diagram in which we could enter those choices. These would be the or choices. It's mental or material or relational. So language is paradigmatic, range of choices. Now, Halliday said what you've got then, though, is sort of a very static sort of description of language. You have here the choices of language. But how can we sort of identify and be able to add to this the element of language changing, that language is dynamic, that the ways that we use language are evolving? So then he added to this sort of network of choices. If we do a corpus linguistic study, we can see the probabilities of you choosing this or that or something else, and add to that sort of network diagram of the paradigmatic choices, the probabilities. And those probabilities change every time you speak, every time you listen, every time there's a use of language. The probabilities are constantly changing. So every utterance perturbs the probability. So the way that we use language feeds back then into our understanding of the systems of language, the kinds of choices. So it's not just you have a choice of this, that, or the other. It is that there are probabilities attached to those choices. So what are the properties of language from a systemic perspective? It is paradigmatic and it is probabilistic. With reference to number 7, with reference to a functional description of text, what is the difference between cohesion and coherence? I mentioned that earlier. We talked about that. And cohesion being, I like the metaphor of texture. It's the patterning that exists, that gives a certain, by the patterning, it gives the cohesiveness to the text. It draws it together. It identifies. It gives the it gives that span of text that's cohesive a certain identity. And that identity is based on the patterning. Now take those cohesively identifiable spans of text, how they are related one to the other will define the architecture, the text. How coherent is the text? How does the text, we say that a text is hierarchically structured, but how are those parts connected? The more obvious the connections between those parts, and this is where theme comes in, thematic progression. This is where conjunctions come in, the ways in which we can signal the connections between our ideas. That makes it more coherent. That gives it an architecture. Halliday describes a clause as a lexicogrammatical unit while the text is a semantic unit. What's the difference between clause as lexicogrammatical unit and text as a semantic unit? I've been talking about this earlier, the idea that the grammar is realized at the level of the clause. When we get to the text, we get sort of, as I said, out of the territory of what we can define grammatically. And that's where RST comes in. But you'll notice that rhetorical structure theory, when it defines the relations between functionally significant spans of text, how does it do so? It does so semantically. And so, what is concession? Well, concession is where the speaker gives priority to one idea while admitting that the other idea also there's also a case for the other. There's also one thing is true, but the other thing you're saying is truer. All right? He's smart, but he's lazy. He's both things, but what you're trying to draw attention to is the lazy part. Now, the point is you're defining it though in terms that are related to meaning semantically. And that is because the text itself is a semantic unit. It comes down to a matter of interpretation. How you interpret these relations between the spans that make up a text. Now, I would argue the point here, and I did argue the point before, that when we looked, for example, at RST relations, even though the relations themselves are defined semantically, there are lots of clues. There's a lot to see in the grammar that guides. But, for example, in that example that I just gave, where he's smart, but he's lazy, the but is a signal of concession. So the signals are there. The grammatical, if you use for an example in English, the to infinitive form of the verb, it largely probably means purpose. We've gone through examples in class before, and I've made this case that yes, the text is a semantic unit. Yes, we look at its coherent structure. We can use rhetorical structure theory to lay out and identify the relations. Those relations in rhetorical structure theory are identified, defined in terms of their semantics, the meaning, not grammar. But nonetheless, grammar does play an important role in how we perceive and how we decide to interpret the text. You remember one of the examples that I gave you and illustrated was the difference between Donald Jung and Susan Rice. And there, the example I was illustrating was the difference in terms of how, and again, I want to make that point, thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. And when we look at what these two speakers, their way of looking at the world, how they construe the world, how they understand the world, a lot is revealed by the way they use language, by the choices they made. Both talked about doing, but they were different in terms of who were the initiators of that doing. For Susan Rice, it's about how people change the world. For Donald Jung, it's how the world changes us, controls. We are not in control. Two different views of the world, two different ideologies. I want to take a look a bit more at Susan Rice's speech, and it's one of the examples that I gave you for looking at how a text, for the first part of the exam. And I gave you two texts. One was Susan Rice, and the other was Steve Jobs. And that's what I would like to look at with you. And it's about 10 to the hour now. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll look at the Susan Rice text. Okay? And if you have questions, then feel free to put them down in the chat. All right? We'll take a break now. Okay, everyone. Let's come back. And there were two questions that I'd like to address that came through on chat. And the first one I'll just answer because it was asked about the exam structure format. And similar to past papers, the first part will be a text that you will need to draw out observations based on three tables that you will be given. The three tables representing transitivity structure, logical structure, and theme structure. Similar to what we've done, similar to the samples that I showed you and we'll discuss today with Susan Rice and Steve Jobs. Okay, so that is, and then the part B is an essay-like question, similar to like what we've been looking at in these 8 questions that were here. Okay, so that's that addresses that. And the other question related to, go back to question 6, probabilities in a systemic functional model. So let me just give you a few slides that related to this question, and it's part of the larger question of the properties of language and the properties of language as a system. The system is paradigmatic, systems of choice. And I said that we could represent it then, as Halliday shows, as a system network. And this system network, what is represented here is very simplified, all right? It's not a full network. A network of choices would be much more expansive, but let's just take this simple illustration to identify what we're talking about. So what we're saying is that in this, a clause is made up of choices related to experiential meaning. And this would be related to the process, the type of process, material, mental, verbal, relational, and so on. And at the same time, a clause is also related to choices of mood type, whether it's going to indicate indicative, which would be interrogative or declarative, a question or a statement, or imperative. All right, so that would be related to interpersonal. And textual, whether the theme is an unmarked theme. What's an unmarked theme? What's typically in a declarative, what is theme? It's the grammatical subject. What's a marked theme then? Well, you put something else into the theme slot at the beginning of a clause. And that will be marked. That will be not the usual, all right? The usual, as I said, in a declarative would be a grammatical subject. But if you put the circumstance in the garden, he found the rose in the garden, you're putting that as theme, and that, we said, displaces the grammatical subject. It's no longer in the theme slot. Something else is there. But that theme now, in the garden, not only displaced the subject as theme, it is a marked theme. It is not the expected. It was a choice, you put it there. All right, so paradigmatic, we have choices. Now, what we're saying is that the choices are and or choices. So we have and choices. In other words, you have to choose a process, a mood type, and a theme when you create the clause. You have to do all three. And there are or choices. Process type would be material, mental, verbal, relational, or whatever. All right? No. But we're also saying that it's not only paradigmatic, it is probabilistic. So this was the question, and that is, what do I mean by probabilistic? I gave you before this. These slides are from earlier in the course, in the semester. And if you remember, there was this interview with Halliday conducted by Ruqaiya Hassan, Jim Martin, and Gunter Kress. And Jim Martin posed this question. He said, this idea of probabilistic systems seems to be something quite critical in your theory, especially in terms of not losing sight of the way in which the text feeds back into the system. And that's quite an important notion, the text. What's the text? Any use of language feeds back into the system. The way you're using language now is going to be making modifications of the total system of choices that you have. That system network. Now, that's Halliday's response. He says, the great problem with the system is that it is a very static form of representation. What we just saw, this layout here, this system network, he's saying it's very static. Yes, it is. It's saying you have this choice and these choices, this range of choices. It freezes the whole thing. And then you have to show, he says, how the actual process of making paths through the system changes the system. What does he mean, paths through the system? Well, the system network, the idea is that you're making a choice. When I start a clause, I have a choice of what kind of process. I have a choice of whether it's the mood is going to be indicative or declarative, or it might be imperative. The choices then, you begin with a clause, and you're gradually working your way through the choices that are being made. That's the path. So to illustrate this, let me go back. So when for example, when you make the choice of mood type, you choose indicative, and then you choose interrogative, and then you choose whether it's WH or a yes, no. That's the path through the system. Gradually getting from more general to more detailed, all right? All right, so that's the system. Now he's saying that you have to show how making that path through the system changes the system. Each pass, as he puts it, through the system changes the system. Every time you talk, every time you produce a text, you change the system. Why? Because what you've done is you've taken these connections and meaning and grammar, and what you've done is you've added the idea of that you have the instances of language, how language is used, and that is going to feed back into, that is going to change the system of language. Now, what is this idea? Think about it like this. What you're saying is you attach the probabilities to each of these choices, and as you use it, those choices are going to be changing in terms of their probabilities depending on what you've heard. What does that mean, though, when we're talking about if you take a look on the left, you have the instances, and on the right, you have the system. And you notice the arrows point both ways. So we're saying it's not just this stratification, it's not just the layers, it's not just these connections. In other words, what you're saying is that the instances of how you use language are going to change the way the language is. The instances, the system. Okay, here's the way to think about it. The analogy that Halliday gives is the climate and the weather. I think you must remember this example. The climate. What's the climate of Hong Kong? It's what you would expect the weather to be like today. Your expectation, based on what? Based on probabilities, based on what the weather has been like on this day in past years. On the basis of over extended period of time, making those observations, those probabilities change year by year. The temperature gets warmer. And so that's going to be reflected in terms of the probabilities of what the temperature might be at this time of year. It's going to change. The weather itself is going to sort of feed back into your perception of what is the climate. Climate, generalization made over time. The weather is what occurs at some point in time. You go outside today, that's the weather. That's now. I think you can begin to see climate is not what you go outside to see. It's a theory about the weather. It's what you expect. It's a hypothesis, all right? What the weather is going to be like. You wake up and you have a hypothesis about the weather will be like based on these generalizations that have been made over time. Now, really, it's the same thing. The weather and the climate, you're still talking about the same thing. Now, this is the analogy. Climate is a theory of the weather. System of meaning potential is a theory of the text. I really like how Halliday puts it like this, because what does that mean? That means that you cannot come to a conclusion about what is the system. You cannot draw conclusions about and generalizations about the language except through the use of language, the text. The text becomes paramount to your being able to make claims and generalizations about what is language. You cannot say this is long, this is parole, and as Chomsky and formalists tend to do, forget parole and we are focusing on long. No, doesn't work that way. Because you cannot get to the idea of what is the system of language unless you go via the text. And so what did Halliday do? Halliday went through and based on a study, the corpus study that he did, he was interested, for example, in the use of tense. And he went through this corpus and he found out how many occurrences were past tense. how many occurrences were non-past. Now, this is a corpus-based study, but what you can think of it like this: you, throughout your life, are building up these frequencies, these probabilities. Because what you hear, what you've heard before is what you are doing with language. You are what you have heard. You are what you have read. Now, Halliday's using a corpus-based study, and interestingly, it was quite interesting, because what he found was that it was typically like a 50-50 or 9-to-1 chance. So primary tense, what he found was past tense versus non-past, 50-50. And non-past could be present tense 90% of the time, future tense 10% of the time. Now, that was in his corpus of study. Now, interesting. What do you think would happen to this sort of statistic, this probability, if what you were looking at was a corpus of weather forecasting? What would happen? Well, when you report the weather, like a weather person, all right, on the news, what they usually tell you, this it's future, it's largely future. You see, it will also depend on the context. It depends on what you're talking about, and that will shape the probabilities. But Halliday's point is taken, and that is that the way you use language, that is feeding, these instances of language are feeding back into what is your perception of the system. And what is the system? The system is not only a set of choices, it is a set of choices with probabilities indicated. Because how does a child acquire language? A child acquires language through hearing language. That's the idea of language is probabilistic. Each instance, each utterance received by, produced by the individual perturbs the probabilities. Okay, I hope that is clear, and thank you for the question. I'm glad to try to respond, and anything not clear, glad to try to hopefully make it clearer. All right, and hopefully that's the case here. All right, so let's carry on. As I mentioned, so for the exam, at the beginning part, you're going to get a text, and you're going to have to, based on what you've observed in terms of the tables and so forth, draw out conclusions. All right, observations. And Susan Rice, she gave this commencement speech at Stanford University, and it was, remember, quite striking, the way she identified those in the ER role. And for sure, I hope by now you know what I mean by that. Those who are the initiators, in this case of doing, 80% were people. What people? I, herself, you, the audience, we together. All right, so that was just in terms of those pronouns, first person, second person pronouns, just in terms of those who in the ER role, 80%. Oh, that was and half the speech is about doing. All in all, if you took all the various kinds of process types, it'd be still very high, 70%. And so we are very much engaged in doing.
So much change has transpired just in my adult lifetime, and you will see so much more in yours. But it doesn't just happen. Progress is the product of human agency. Things get better because we make them better. And things go wrong when we get too comfortable, when we fail to take risks, or seize opportunities. Never trust that the abstract forces of history will end a war, or that luck will cure a disease, or that prayers alone will save a child. If you want change, you have to make it. If we want progress, we have to drive it.
Okay, so I hope that we've got that context in mind, all right? This is the way she speaks. So now, if, for example, the text is something on the exam which you have, what I'm trying to see how to say this in the best way, all right, in the appropriate way. You should be going back and referring to past texts to draw conclusions about what you see. You don't see that text just by itself. You see it in the context of other texts of similar nature, if not just necessarily by the same speaker or writer, but definitely what I would be expecting of you is, because you it is open book in the sense you do have everything to go back over. What I'm interested in is what you've learned from the semester. And one thing, what I would be expecting you to do is to go back and look at previous texts that would have a relevancy to what it is you're saying about this text. All right, that I hope that's clear. You definitely should be referring back to, wherever possible, discussions that we've had about texts, not just necessarily by the same. So, example, in the midterm, you had this example of Romney's performance in the debate. Well, of course, I expected you to go back and to be comparing with what we were saying about Obama's performance in that same debate. And looking at, you had some statistics already and which you could be comparing. This is what I would expect you to be doing. So I do expect you to be familiar with what we have covered, what we have talked about. So you should go back and you should sort of go through the previous lectures, but make a note of in which lecture is such and such discussed, all right? You don't know the text going into the exam, what text that will be, but you should have within your sort of written down what texts we have looked at, so you know what lecture to go back to and what to be looking up. All right, so this is now, I don't want to, it's from the same speech, and this is, it's the conclusion of her talk, all right? So let's listen and hear this text. You will, on the exam, not listen to it, all right? You'll only be reading whatever text you see. You won't be looking at it and hearing it. If there will be no video or any audio to go with the exam, all right? It would just be the text itself that you're looking at. So, but instead of today just reading the text, let's listen to it.
And finally, as you're changing the world, never neglect family. They're not just your foundation. They're the source of life's greatest fulfillment, as all the parents here can testify. Both my parents were recently struck by serious illnesses. My colleagues were tremendous about stepping in for me at the halls of the United Nations. But nobody could step in for me or my brother at the hospital. There's usually someone else who can do your job, but there's nobody else who can be a loving child or a devoted parent. Like those before you, your generation will contribute. It will innovate, and it will serve in unique ways. But today, change is coming faster than ever. And you must shape that change. You can be that change, not for an election, but for a lifetime. If you remember nothing else of what I said, try to remember that little boy. Remember that he is somebody's beloved son. Remember that he counts as much as any of us. Remember that we cannot afford to sleep easy while he suffers. Remember that you can make his life better. Above all, remember that each of us has a profound responsibility to try with all of our skill, all of our smarts, and all of our soul. So make him safe, make progress, and make us proud. Congratulations again, and Godspeed.
All right, now, some things that we take a look at, and that would be, for example, transitivity. And what this would be sort of maybe the statistic that you could observe, and that would be how many I, 1, you, more so, we or us, 2 times, other, 13 times. Okay, so that's, the closing seemed to be somewhat different than what we observed before. All right. What about the logical? And logical here, we're talking about dependent clauses. How are the clauses combined? Hypotaxis, parataxis, elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting. All right, so you have the table. And you take a look at this. What would we observe? Okay, let me just sort of color it in for now and identify sort of what we can see. So we have, and finally, as you're changing the world. So the red is hypotaxis. We see it not that often, okay, as repeated twice. And then in paragraph 32, if you try to remember while he suffers, so forth, okay. Not much hypotaxis. Parataxis. You can see that in blue, all right. Use of but in 114, but in 115. Semicolon in 116 and so forth. So again, some instances of parataxis. Simple. Both my parents were recently struck by serious illnesses. 113, 117, 118. Well, there doesn't seem to be a great deal to say. Now, remember that, okay? In the sense that not every aspect, not every feature of language will reveal some patterning that will be, in this case, worth mention. There doesn't seem to be heavily either hypotaxis. There's not a lot of hypotaxis. There's not a lot of parataxis. What is there a lot of? What there is a lot of is the imperative. And that we can see highlighted in blue here, the light blue. Remember, 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 remember. Now this would be something that you would obviously be noticing. The repetition of that verb, remember, and the use of in this case, the mood structure, the imperative. The whole ending is just the imperative, remember, remember. Now, what kind of speech is this? This speech is a commencement speech. What have we said about commencement speeches? We've observed that commencement speeches are largely motivational. They're intended to motivate you to do something. Who? The graduates, who you're addressing. And so this fits with our expectations about what we would see in a commencement speech. The use of the imperative, the mood structure, and this remember is repeated. That's a very clear pattern that you see there. And then at the very end, make him safe, make progress, make us proud. The repetition in threes. All right, so those kinds of things we've seen in speeches before, and you would be mentioning it, and you would be highlighting the fact that this fits with our expectations of what we would find in a commencement speech. Now, when it comes to looking at the sort of parataxis versus hypotaxis, we do notice that even though there's not a great deal of one or the other, they do sort of, there's a lot of the projection. Why? What's the projection? You remember, right? Remember. Now, go back. Remember that. Remember that. Remember that. All those that clauses are projection. And because you have a mental process, remember, which you are repeating, you're getting a lot of the projection. Now, that in itself is going to be the large chunk that you see here, 5. If you take that away, you've basically got paratactic, hypotactic. Let's put the numbers here. We have 7 simple clauses. We have 25 clauses that are part of some complex clause. What do I mean by a complex clause? Paratactic or hypotaxis. 2 clauses related, either through parataxis or hypotaxis. You know what I mean now, right? Between simple versus complex. So we have 32 clauses altogether. Now, let's take a look. Of those 7 simple clauses, how many are imperative? 3. And of those complex clauses, how many are imperative? 7. There are 10 imperatives here. Fully a third are imperative of the clauses. All right, now come back to what we were looking at in terms of transitivity. We said, well, there wasn't a lot of you and I and we. A lot of other. Now, factor into this the use of the imperative. We have 10 imperatives. What is an imperative? The imperative is without the subject, without the finite, but the subject we know. Who is it? You. It's directed at you. It's understood. It's you. You add those into this, it makes for a very different picture in terms of transitivity. It is largely being addressed to you. Do you get the point? It may not have been obvious from just the transitivity, the structure. It doesn't look like anything in particular. But when you factor into it, that in fact we have 10 imperatives, it changes the picture. You have to look at these tables side by side, not just in isolation, but look at them for what they're saying. And the main thing is, as I've always said, fit the text to the context. What is the context? What's taking place? Who's talking to whom? What are they talking about? How is it being delivered? All right, now, I will come back to Steve Jobs in a moment, but I want to go into sort of a larger picture here by way of review, not just in terms of the questions, but wanted to sort of ask this question: where is the art in verbal art? And I wanted to get at a linguistic explanation. Now, you remember that Halliday had this to say. It's very relevant to us in text linguistics. What is important is that we should be able to use the same theory, method of linguistic analysis, the same grammatics, Why does he use grammatics? Remember, it's not linguistics, it's grammatics, because his focus is on the grammar. Because that's what he's saying is really, that you can actually make observations about. And because your focus is on the grammar, you can apply it to whatever kind of text you're trying to interpret. The whole focus should be on any kind of text, should be able to be analyzed in the same way. Otherwise, what's the alternative? The alternative is approaching each text with an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary. In other words, nothing substantial is said because it's all sort of ad hoc. You will have no way of explaining the similarities, the differences, the aesthetic, what makes it art, functional, what is the purpose that differentiate one text from another? What makes for one text to be art and another no? And its functional values, is it intended to motivate, like a commencement speech? And so we can compare commencement speeches, right? But we need a method, an approach to the study of the text that is based on how meaning is realized. Halliday describes a language as being more than a semiotic system. It is a system that makes meanings. It is a semogenic system. And again, I come back to the point, why is it make meaning? It's because you are making choices. That's what it comes down to. You are making a choice. And by making that choice, you are deciding how you make meaning. Now, what is meaning? We've said it's the meta functions. And I come back to that point. The ideational includes the two subcomponents, experiential, logical, the interpersonal, enacting social relationships, the textual, meaning materialized. But what enables this then meaning in language is the grammar, the lexicogrammar. See, Halliday doesn't see a difference really between the words and grammar. We like to differentiate. You go to a dictionary to look up words. You go to a grammar book to see the grammar. But what Halliday is saying is that both are really like two sort of complementary aspects of language. The words and the wording. When you look at the choices that are being made, as you work your way through that network of choices, you're defining the clause. And as you get to the end, the words are what make up and conclude and put that clause together. What enables this meaning-making potential language is the lexicogrammar. It's the wording. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. And so when we talk about the wording, we're talking about what kind of processes are taking place, who initiates, who's affected. I'm not going to go through the list. We've discussed it already. But you see the idea, you have meaning and you have the wording. And so our focus is on the wording in order to get at what is the meaning. So a question, by thinking grammatically, how much can one learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? By thinking grammatically, how much can one learn? What can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? Poems, for example. Remember Russell Mears? I mentioned him. He is the emeritus professor of psychiatry at the University of Sydney, and he says the words of a poem are used in a symbolic way. They have more than a single meaning. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way, that's critical, is to evoke a sense of reality none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise, it is indefinite. The effect of these few simple words, it's not just about the words, it's about the wordings, how the words are combined in a particular way. This is what the grammar shows us. Oh, you remember Halliday did a study of Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam, and we discussed about this. Excuse me. Sorry. Turn off my phone. Excuse me. Halliday did this study, and it's in this volume on text and discourse, and it's his analysis of In Memoriam, Alfred Lord Tennyson's. And in that discussion, he has this to say. He says the grammar of this passage is that of spoken rather than that of written language. Difference. Remember, I asked you about that before. Spoken versus written. He's saying that the poem itself reads like more spoken kind of language. This is seen, as he says, most clearly in the clause complexes, also in transitivity patterns, where there's little nominalization or other grammatical metaphor. Much of the lexical content is in the verbs. Then Halliday goes on to say this. There's an excellent discussion of this in a little paper by Walker Gibson, written in 1958, in the course of which he remarks, and this is important, I submit then that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. His poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. Remember what Hassan was saying about language and what it tells us about verbal art. The idea that there are two orders of meaning. The idea that you have the way we speak and what we're speaking about, but then added to this another layer through something she calls symbolic articulation. And unpack that. What does it mean? Articulating, expressing symbols. And what are symbols? Symbols are metaphors. As she puts it, where the meanings of language are turned into signs having a deeper meaning, another order of meaning. And this order of meaning she talks about as being achieved through foregrounding. How this metaphor is articulated is through foregrounding. And as David Butt puts it, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. And the whole purpose of all of this, the whole purpose of it is to express a hypothesis, the artist's hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. There's a point to it. There is a meaning beyond just the words as they're put together and what they express. Now, as Hassan admits, she says this does not necessarily mean that theme is what initially engages the reader, but it's what's going to stay in your mind. It's what's going to stay in the reader's consciousness long after the pleasure of encountering the artistic turn of phrases has dissipated itself, long after you've forgotten the words. This is what you're going to remember. This is what will stick with you. So what is theme in Hassan's sense? And again, I have to tell you, remind you to differentiate this. This is not Halliday's sense of theme. This isn't what occurs first in a clause. This is what she's talking about is in a literary sense. This is that second order of meaning. This is the hypothesis that is being expressed about by the artist about some aspect of the life of social man. She goes on to say this, the patterns of language are so deployed as to take us in a particular direction. The patterning is taking you in a direction. Each message is a message by itself, but the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. All of it put together is there to create this theme, this hypothesis. The theme becomes accessible. How do we discover the theme? By examination of the meaning of individual messages. Yes, the clauses themselves, guided by the repatterning of patterns. In other words, taking those patterns and then re-patterning, creating a pattern, creating an automatic, creating a default, and then changing it. And what you've produced then is the work of art, an extended metaphor. The symbol, it has symbolic value. It has symbolic meaning. Now, Halliday, as I've said, he prefers the term de-automatization. A little bit more general in the sense that it can apply also to verbal science. Halliday prefers Mukarovsky's term de-automatization to foregrounding. As he puts it, since what is in question is not simply prominence, but rather the partial freeing of the lower level systems from the control of the semantics so that they become domains of choice in their own right. It's not simply foregrounding. Foregrounding is what stands out against a background. Halliday is saying it's more than that. It's not just the idea of foreground. It's not just the prominence. It's rather that you can take a default and change the default. That's de-automatization. That this is usually what these what this wording expresses, but here you're using it in such a way as to say something else. Go beyond the grammar as it stands, to go beyond it to another level of meaning. Artistically creating an automatization. That's what Butt is talking about when he says mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice. Taking what we usually do with language and producing from it a non-habitual consistency. Creating an automatic, creating an automatization, creating a default against which, for the poet, for the verbal artist, it is to de-automatize. Creating a pattern in order to break the pattern. Now, the question came, though, how do we distinguish between, on the one hand, this artistically intended act of de-automatization or foregrounding? How do we distinguish art from just, well, a statistical sort of you can demonstrate statistically that the pattern is there and that it changes. And how do you distinguish whether this is, as she puts it, whether it's the occurrence of a particular linguistic phenomena whose prominence, though perhaps statistically demonstrable, nevertheless is not part of the artist's craft, does not contribute to the overall meaning of the work of art? How do you identify intended art, as opposed to just what happens to occur? Foregrounding of a pattern depends on both contrast and consistency. In contrast, remember Les Murray's poem, The Widower in the Country, and Hassan's analysis of it. And she identified doing is in contrast to all the other process types. The widower is the doer in contrast with other participants. The repetition of the conjunction and sets a background of simple parataxis in contrast with more complex clauses which combine parataxis, hypotaxis, and rank shifting. The future tense in contrast with other tenses. The widower in theme position in contrast with other things in theme position. All of these contrasts. But it's not just a matter of finding the contrast, it's also looking for the consistency. Butt talks about it as being a semantic drift. And he says it like this: the manner in which an ensemble collection of features take the reader towards the same general kind of meaning. Where can you find a sort of consistency where these contrasts co-occur at these various levels of wording and grammar, and they co-occur in such a way as to all sort of point you in some particular direction. Location. Where in the text does it come through that you see this, the text as a collection, and you see the location of these sort of ensemble of features. But talks about a consistency of choices across strata. Well, strata meaning across different kinds of meaning. Weaves what Butt calls the poem's existential fabric. This consistency of choices. As we saw, whether it was transitivity, logical, tense, there was a consistency though. Where is that consistency? What is it? It's pointing out as sort of a existential fabric, pointing to the extended metaphor that is being created. Now, you remember that Hassan points to where these kinds of foregrounding do sort of consistently join, and they join at certain points of the poem. With my armful of wood, pause to look across the Christmas paddocks aching in the heat. Again, the foregrounding occurs at several levels. Roof reflects the sun, makes my eyes water and close on bright web vision smeared on the dark of my thoughts to dance and fade away. Screaming. All of these point to this sort of existential fabric of the loss, the grief that this widower feels, the loneliness that he feels. And Hassan says on one level, the poem is a realistic picture of personal bereavement, mourning, and the meaning of bereavement. On another deeper level, the poem deals with the centrality of human relations for the preservations of a sense of humanity. Les Murray's Widower in the Country, she says, points to its theme concerning the essence of humanity, to be human, to be an individual. You need to be with others. What makes human existence sane, what protects it from nightmarish chimeras and others' company. This is the theme. He has created, by contrast, at several levels that consistently can be identified within the text, pointing to a particular overall meaning, pointing to this theme, pointing to this hypothesis. Need for others. There is then, in language, this sort of socio-therapeutic function. As Hassan puts it, to make the readers more human than they were before they came to read that literature, to change people's perspective. In other words, the art serves a purpose. It isn't just the expression of the artist's hypothesis. It's in a way trying to make readers. It serves a function. Now, I wanted to take a look at what we've been talking about in the context of looking at two performances. Now, both of these I have discussed before, and I want to come back to them and to look at them in the context of what we've been looking at in the other speeches. But it's time for a break. We'll take a break and then come back at this point. Okay, so let's take a break now. Okay. As I mentioned, I want to today look at two examples, and they are related to texts that I have mentioned before, but hopefully maybe give some additional perspective on them. And the two that I'm going to be mentioning, the first one I'm going to be talking about is Brandon Leake's a spoken word performance. And if you remember, this was the winner of this. Let me put these correct. This was the winner for America's Got Talent. And what was striking, and as I mentioned, both of the texts I'm going to be looking at sort of challenge typical cultural norms, expectations. This spoken word performance, it wasn't expected, yet it went on to win quite a very positive reaction, as you can see here.
Hi. How are you? What is your name?
My name is Brandon Leak.
Hi, Brandon Leak. And where are you from, Brandon?
I am from a small little city called Stockton, California.
Stockton, California. And what do you do for a living?
For a living, I work at a high school and a college, but I also run poetry workshops with youth in my city.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. So poetry, is that what you're going to be doing tonight?
Yes, I'm actually the first spoken word artist that you guys are ever going to have hit this stage. So I'm super excited to bring poetry to y'all.
Tell me, because I don't really understand poetry, I'm going to be honest with you.
I'm a great intro for you. I bring more about life experience, things that everyday people go through.
And where could this lead to if you did well on the show, Brandon?
Well, I have like a huge aspiration of being able to put on my own large production one-man show.
Okay.
So tonight's poem, is it something you wrote?
Oh, I only perform stuff that I write, never be able to perform anything else.
And what is it? What is this one about?
So tonight's poem is actually an ode to my sister.
Are you close to your sister?
Very much. She's here with me now.
Oh, she's backstage?
Kind of.
Well, we already love you. Make us love your poem.
Beautiful. I got you for that.
All right, now he went on. This was the first audition. This was the when they come out for the first time, and as you can see, there is sort of an expectation: how can he succeed? Poetry. People, as Simon Cowell said, don't understand poetry. But after he finishes, this was the response.
Wow.
It is a wow.
Flowers across the sea, memories are what they used to be.
You're tearing up.
My brother passed away the same year that your sister passed away.
Man.
Yeah, I can feel your pain. I know what this is. I know what it is to have somebody taken from you without you knowing. But it was very beautiful for me.
Thank you.
What an amazing tribute. There's something very, very special about you.
Thank you.
Really. This is a very difficult thing for me to judge. I shouldn't be judging it. I just want to compliment you on what you just did, because it was extraordinary.
Thank you for so much.
Really?
So much.
Well, it's amazing to me that on season 15, it's the first time that we're hearing somebody of spoken word. There was something more raw in the way it's like singing and talking and just being a human a cappella. No music, no nothing, just a raw heart beating in front of us. We feel your pain, we feel your love, and you moved me to do this.
They speak of a better place. They speak of kingdoms and how they come. They speak of freedom and marching drums. Freedom and marching drums.
You're amazing, buddy.
That was a really strong reaction. That was, I mean, and people went on when he continued his going through the various stages and so forth. And he ended up becoming the winner of America's Got Talent. What was there about him speaking that got that kind of reaction, that wow. Halliday says this. He says, in real life, texts carry value. We need to explain that value in terms of what we know about semiosis, about meaning and how meaning is made. Now, the question I asked at the beginning was, how well can we explain what's going on here? So we look at the text, and I've mapped out here this performance. And I've followed like rhetorical structure theory, and you'll notice that it's largely quite paratactic in terms of its architecture. Let's just look at the first 4 sentences, all right?
I have 2 facts for you. 1, I'm 6 feet tall. And 2, love is the most vulnerable thing one will ever have. And you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully.
Okay, so we notice the rhyme, okay? We notice it's quite paratactic, and. We'll go on to sentences 5 through 8.
On July 14th, 1996, an angel was brought to this earth. Her name, Danielle Marie Gibson, but I only know her as Puff. Her smile is as wide as the universe. Her eyes, they glimmer like the stars. She is my world and my sister.
Okay, and we notice that it's largely the clauses are quite simple clauses. All right, 6, 7, 8, they're all simple clauses, and still there is the rhyme. Sentences 9 through 10.
I, just 4 years old at the time, learned what it meant to love selflessly, for on days in which my strength was but knee-high, seeing her smiling face would make my soul fly,
But notice that there's something coming. But, and then followed by that pause. Now, so far we've had rather simple clauses and rhyme, and now but. And then let's see what happens with going on sentences. Carry on from 11. That but sort of signals a break within the poem, in his performance. Just taking a look at the beginning, note the sentences with simple clauses highlighted in yellow. Some have embedding, all right, those are highlighted in green. But there are no taxes, relationships here. So quite simple, quite what you would expect in spoken discourse, yes, spoken language. And we notice the rhyme. And not a great deal of embedding, except as you notice at the box at the bottom, that highlighted in yellow. So it has a texture, it has a similarity. There is a consistency in terms of the kinds of the simplicity, the logical simplicity, in terms of the choice of rhyme and so on. Let's look at sentences 11.
On March 23rd, 1997, I've been ground-bound because she left Earth to go back home amongst the stars, right next to God, but I was left here to manufacture wings out of tears and broken dreams, yet I'm still haunted by these nightmares because I have a really creative mind, and sometimes it designs these alternate realities where she is still here, still alive, and all the things I wish we could have done are played again and again and again, and I'm tired of playing God because I gotta come to terms with the fact that my sister ain't never coming back.
Okay, now, quite striking in terms of if you take a look at sentences, these two, beginning after that, but, yes, at this point, he's talking about his sister having passed away. And notice the grammar is rather different. One thing, if we did a look at the number of content words per sentence, notice what happens with 13. Notice how it jumps. It's very different than what has been uttered so far. 13 is quite striking. And it's where you feel his emotion. And finally, sentences 14 and 15.
And that's the cost of love. Caring for someone so much that you can't imagine living life without them. Staring at a grave like How about I trade my 6 feet for yours, but that's not real. And I know I said earlier to hold on to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. But if this pain and these memories are all that I got left of you, I won't never regret these scars from just trying to hold on to you.
Notice some things have been taking place. First of all, how he begins. There is a repetition at the beginning in the fourth sentence, repetition of verbs to hold on to, leaves, won't exit. That repeated at the end in sentence 15. You'll notice that there is in the middle, when he changed, that but occurs before 11, and it now changes to passive voice, ground bound, was left, haunted. He's not in control. These are happening outside of him. What is happening to him is not in his control. It's not related. He's not the initiator of the action. It's being done to him. You'll also notice at the beginning, he talks about 6 feet tall, and at the end is 6 feet tall. So there is this sort of circularity. Now, if you take a look at the use of conjunctions, you'll notice from 11 onwards that every clause has a conjunction. And especially, you'll notice the frequency of the conjunctions and. But we have that but at 11 that signals the change in the partitioning of this particular performance. Then the but in 12, between 11 and 12, begins us on this sort of looking at and noticing the change that's taking place. And you'll notice that instead of not just paratactic, but it's also quite hypotactic, where we have this really increase in this lexical density. We notice the increased use of hypotaxis instead of parataxis. There are changes that have occurred. Those changes outside of his control. And we see a change from the simplicity of before to the complexity, and to whereas there was balance and symmetry, there is now asymmetry. These are observations that we can then make. The presence and the absence of rhyme at the beginning and then at the end, where he comes to terms with his loss. Simple versus complex, parataxis versus hypotaxis, the lexical density, the very parallel opening and closing. So what is the theme? Coming to terms with loss. That's how I'd see it. That's how I would see what he's telling us about this aspect of social life that he's experienced. But there was a craft, there was an art to the way that was designed. And it had that impact, it had that response that we saw in terms of how it was judged. And then later, in terms of his spoken word performances, how the general public responded as well. The next one I want to look at is David Foster Wallace. And I mentioned him to you before, and also his commencement speech. The speech that was delivered at Kenyon College. Now, interestingly, Time magazine put down what are the top 10 commencement speeches. David Foster Wallace, number 1. Steve Jobs, number 2. Remember Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs, we noticed that he included sort of the contrast. That was very deliberate. Dropped out, dropped in, looking forward, looking backwards, the heaviness, the lightness, life, death, old, new. The rule of 3, repetition of phrases, words in threes, repeatedly throughout, about serif and sans serif typefaces, varying the amounts of space, about what makes great typography great, about, and that we see repeated. So there was a very deliberate design to his speech as well. Now, how did he structure his commencement speech?
Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories.
So let's take a look at the first story. And it's the first story that I gave you when I showed you the analysis.
The first story is about connecting the dots. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
Now that was just the conclusion. And it's very first person. I mean, you don't have the other stories, but first story, you can see so much mention of I. Now, if I take a look at the processes and the types of process, for example, and I'm looking at the first story, and just taking a look at the first story, we notice that material processes, 56%, largely about doing. I, 1/3 of it is about I. Well, those stories are his stories. At the conclusion, he's addressing you. But at the beginning of it, throughout the telling of the story, it's his story. So obviously going to be first person. When I take a look at this simple versus complex, now, and I noticed that, for example, when I looked at the speeches of Nixon and Obama, simple, 11%. Nixon's resignation speech, 5%. It was only his departure speech that was sort of spontaneous, that was 54%. Obama's generally 18, 14% for across the board. Now, Steve Jobs slightly higher than Obama, but 21% simple. The speech comes through very casually. In terms of parataxis versus hypotaxis, here it pretty much fits with all what we've been observing in the speeches that have been given by Nixon and Obama. And again, except for that departure speech. So it's obviously written out. It's obviously prepared. It's not spontaneous. And it reflects that in the balance between parataxis and hypotaxis. One thing that's interesting is the second story. The second story, you almost notice, is almost half-half. Remember, that was like Obama's inaugural, half-half almost, and people didn't respond well to that. They felt it was very diffuse. Interestingly, what was the second story? The second story was about Steve Jobs getting fired. And it's very different than the first story and the third story. But throughout, it's more or less leading up to you. That, you notice, is, especially when it gets to the end of each story, it becomes about you. And in at the very end of his speech, then it's all about you. Now, this is how Steve Jobs' speech concluded.
When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic, overflowing with neat tools and great notions. Stuart and his team put out several issues of the Whole Earth Catalog, and then, when it had run its course, they put out a final issue. It was the mid-1970s, and I was your age. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
So that's Steve Jobs. Inspirational. Ends with that imperative, stay hungry, stay foolish. Is meant to motivate them to go on. Yes, he gives his experience in the first 3 stories, but it fits with what one would expect, and it ends, and very interestingly, every story ends with that sort of second person, you. But what about David Foster Wallace? This commencement speech that he gave at Kenyon College in 2005. Now, he was a very well-known writer, novelist.
Greetings, thanks, and congratulations to Kenyon's graduating class of 2005. There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise older fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish.
Okay, so right away from the beginning, we realize that he doesn't intend to give a commencement speech like other commencement speeches. Time magazine had this to say about his commencement speech. This address at Kenyon was vintage Wallace. Smart, occasionally meandering discussion of the issues that consumed him, from the banality of life to the meaning of consciousness. He says, "I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy and grandly inspirational. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. All the reasons Wallace didn't make it to 50 are apparent here. In hindsight, the speech reads like the first draft of a suicide note for an author who took his own life last year at age 46. While it's a macabre read, there's tons that's worthwhile here. The speech crackles with wit and intelligence and offers tricks for escaping the depression to which Wallace ultimately succumbed. David Foster Wallace was most well known for this novel, Infinite Jest. The Guardian describes Infinite Jest as one of the most influential books of its time. The suicide figures very prominently in the book. There was a book tour for Infinite Jest, and Wallace was joined on the book tour by a journalist from Rolling Stone magazine, David Lipsky. Lipsky wrote a book about the days that he spent with Wallace, and that was turned into a movie, The End of the Tour. Jason Segel as Wallace and Jesse Eisenberg as Lipsky. Lipsky asked whether Wallace's addictions had motivated his descriptions of depression and suicide in the novel. This is from the movie, The End of the Tour.
You awake?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, it wasn't a chemical imbalance and it wasn't drugs and alcohol. I think, it was much more that I lived an incredibly American life. This idea that if I could just achieve X and Y and Z, that everything would be okay. There's a thing in the book about how when somebody leaps from a burning skyscraper, it's not that they're not afraid of falling anymore, it's that the alternative is so awful. And so then you're invited to consider what could be so awful that leaping to your death would seem like an escape from it. And I don't know if you have any experience with this kind of thing, but it's worse than any kind of physical injury. It may be in the old days what was known as a spiritual crisis. Feeling as though every axiom of your life turned out to be false and there was actually nothing. And you were nothing. And it's all a delusion, and you're so much better than everybody because you can see that this is just a delusion, and you're so much worse because you can't fucking function. It's really horrible. I don't think that we ever change. I'm sure that I still have those same parts of me. I guess I'm trying really hard to find a way not to let them drive. You know? Anyway, I'm okay. Good night.
The Kenyon College commencement address. David Foster Wallace did go on to, after this, he committed suicide, and it was tragic, and yet there were indications of it in what he was saying.
Perhaps the most sad and poignant of my examples tonight, and this is, I always shudder a little bit when I read it, is David Foster Wallace, who was a great writer. He was a novelist, an American novelist. At least I don't have any idea, frankly, how well known he was across the world, but in America he was one of the leading lights of postmodern novelists and writers. And he was highly respected and loved. A couple of years ago, he committed suicide in his late 40s. Not too long before he committed suicide, he gave a commencement address at a liberal arts college. And this commencement address, as soon as it was given, was noted by many people as being unusual because David Foster Wallace, like a lot of postmodern writers, is impenetrable. He's a very hard, when you read his work, you have no idea what it means, and you're supposed to sit and discuss it and think about it, and that's it, that's the point. Many folks pointed out that this commencement speech was very, very lucid, unusually lucid and direct. And accessible, but it was not long before he killed himself, and listen to this.
Okay, so we're going to take a look at a bit of his speech, but what I want you to notice is that why the response the way it is, given it was not obviously intended to be the typical commencement speech. The speaker that you just heard, is very lucid, it's very clear, not like his usual writing. It really doesn't seem to be what you would expect in a commencement speech. Well, let's take a look at it, though. How it's not poetry, it's not a spoken word performance, it's a commencement speech. But I want to take a look at what we see, some things that we can identify in the use of language within this text. Now, previous time I showed you that video that was based on his speech and taken part of his speech and make this video. This is another part of the same speech that he's giving. We're just listening to him here.
The point here is that I think this is one part of what teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean. To be just a little less arrogant, to have just a little critical awareness about myself and my certainties, because a huge percentage of the stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and deluded. I have learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduates will too. Here is just one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely talk about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive. but it's pretty much the same for all of us. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There is no experience you have had that you are not at the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real.
Now notice there's this one rather lengthy sentence. And if we, again, start looking at the lexical density, the number of content words, you'll notice that in sentence 5, it's quite brief. And then suddenly jumps in 6. And what we're going to be taking a look at, and you can sort of see what will progress throughout the rest of the speech, is that he'll have this valley, and which then it will be suddenly so simple in terms of the number of content words, so few, and then suddenly it jumps and it becomes so predominant it brings out, it foregrounds something that he's trying to say. The total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Now, what's the point that he's trying to make? Really, it's that we shouldn't be so, our default setting is me first. That's basically what he's sort of attacking here. Continuing, where I've highlighted in yellow is where you have a very simple sentence, and you see it in 15. This is not a matter of virtue. And then goes on to make his point. Continuing. 19, likewise, is very short, very brief, and then comes to this point where he says probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education. And then it's his personal experience that he's highlighting, trying to make the point, paying attention to what is going on in front of me, paying attention to what is going on inside me. Again, it continues where you have these brief, very short sentences followed by, again, what we see here, and what I think is a device that he's using, and that is before, what is foregrounded is not the simplicity, but what's being foregrounded is where he gets to his point, and that point is foregrounded in usually something which is quite lexically dense, in which he's making his point. The whole focus, I did a word cloud of the verbs that he uses. The whole focus is on thinking and what one thinks.
I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
Halliday, talks about something called anti-language. He describes it like this. He says, the anti-language arises when the alternative reality is a counter-reality, set up in opposition to some established norm. It is thus not the distance between the two realities, but the tension between them that is significant. The distance need not be very great. The one is, in fact, a metaphorical variant of the other. This is an extended metaphor that we see with David Foster Wallace's commencement speech. It is a counter reality. It isn't the usual commencement speech, by no means. But it reflects his own way of thinking. In many ways, I describe it as an anti-text. It is an anti-commencement speech. As he himself says, it's the standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of stories. But he is not here to tell the story. He's not here to be the wise old fish telling the younger fish what they're supposed to do. And as he concludes, this stuff probably, he says, doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational. Not the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. It's about an alternative reality, an alternative to the default setting. Really, what one means by de-automatization. As he puts it, that is real freedom. That is being educated, understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. That's what his whole speech is. His whole speech is about choosing not to take the automatic, not to take the default. What's the default? That it's all about me. But choosing to be aware that that is how we think, and choosing to do otherwise. But he's doing so in a commencement speech, and he's doing so in a very anti-commencement speech type way of doing it. So in this process of sort of saying that one needs to de-automatize, his speech is itself a de-automatization of what we would expect in that kind of context. It is the anti-text. That brings us to a close, and close to the course, Text Linguistics. I hope what you take away from it is an awareness of how we use language. The choices that we make. Language is choice. It's how we choose to live. It's how we choose to see the world. It's how we choose to use language. That comes through in the way that we talk, in the way that we write, in the way that we speak. So I hope that the message that you take away from looking at this is that language matters. Language makes meaning, and I hope that wish you success and wish you well on your studies, on your coursework, on your exam for my course, and for your other courses as well. And I wish that you might take away the message that, not the message that one might feel is unhappy about David Foster Wallace. But I think there's a truth to what he's saying, and that is that indeed we need to be living with an awareness that maybe our default setting, the way that we see the world, there is something beyond it. There is an alternative. And that alternative is really what he would describe as living. So I wish you all the best, and we will stop there. And again, if you have questions, then please do let me know. All right. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the course.